Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 10th of July 2019, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish, and we're delighted to welcome Alex Thompson. And of course, Alex bringing us Eastern approaches and reporting on matters from the Netherlands.
Well, we're going to start with Kim Darroch. If you remember, we mentioned on Monday the memos that were apparently leaked. This is possibly an even bigger leak than the Huawei one. But anyway, if you remember what he said was in his memos, things like, we don't really believe this. This is a Trump administration is going to become substantially more normal, less dysfunctional, less unpredictable, less faction-driven, less diplomatically clumsy and inept. And he followed that up with comments like media reports of vicious infighting and chaos in the White House are mostly true. Well, the chaos has built as these revelations hit the press. Well, today he has decided that he's going to resign. So he's resigned as UK ambassador to the United States. This was after Trump had called him a very stupid guy and basically said that he wasn't going to work with them anymore
Sounds quite reasonable to me.
Well, let's welcome Alex to the program. Welcome back to the program. Alex, what are your thoughts on the whole Darroch affair?
I think actually this has been best put by Craig Murray, a Foreign Office man in the past, whom I used to write the reports directly for, actually, who at the time I was trained to hate. But he's persuaded me and a lot of other ex-Foreign Office and hangers-on by his persistent blogging and speaking. And Murray has pointed out that Darroch got his career advancement during the Blair years when the standards went down the pan. You would never in the past have got a man getting to British ambassador in Washington without him having some diplomatic skills. But this lot are actually potty-mouthed and have been the terror of their own underlings in the Foreign Office before ever reaching such posts.
So do you think there's something unusual about these? Because obviously these comments were not meant for public consumption.
What's unusual about them, Mike, is that they are of no breeding. There's no culture, and I'm not trying to make a classist issue here. It's good that men like him from the north of England have been able to get in. A fine example of that is Peter Ford, who was not of a traditional, it was the same generation, not a traditional Foreign Office entry family, but like Darroch, got to Oxford, Durham in Darroch's case, and then got into the Foreign Office in the mid-70s. The difference is, the foul-mouthed language orally is very unusual in the past, and putting thoughts to paper about dysfunctionality and there's no hope of redemption simply shows that Darroch is not a man who was actually moulded by wiser, older and better people as he came up the ranks of the Foreign Office. I think that's the radical departure. He's speaking on behalf of an ahistorical, self-interested, self-referent caste which took over the Foreign Office in the 90s.
Yeah, okay, but obviously he was delivering these memos to people, including Mark Sedwill, for example, and he clearly hasn't been criticised by the current Foreign Office incumbents. So this is a broader culture than just him then?
Well, absolutely. And the mechanism through which it was spun out was that of the National Security Council, a role which used to be simply the Joint Intelligence Committee or the Cabinet in terms of ministers. But at the early 2010s, some Foreign Office men and MI6 men behind them thought it would be a jolly good wheeze to spin this out into an NSC. And of course, Darroch was one of the chairmen of this nascent institution. And indeed, Sedwill has become the next one, or the latest incarnation. So there is a self-perpetuation involved here. Foreign Office grandees get spun out to be the level of management and presentation and selection between intelligence and diplomacy and the cabinet and the prime minister. So of course this is a self-perpetuating mechanism.
Yeah, and just to finish this this little section off then, so he would have been National Security Advisor, head of the NSC, amongst the same types of people that have been involved with Sergei Skripal and the Russiagate affair. So that would have been Dearlove and Christopher Steele and people like this.
Yes, he's about 2012, 2013, if I recall correctly, something like the second ever NSC chairman. So he wouldn't have overlapped with Steele, who left MI6 in 2009, the same year I left GCHQ. But he will have overlapped, I think, with Sir Richard Dearlove, and certainly some of the others in that group, yes.
Okay, thank you for that.
I'll just say, Alex, I find it fascinating that Blair's name gets mentioned because I'm desperately trying to remember a few names, but of course there was a so-called blind trust set up which helped bring Tony Blair into power. And if I remember, one of the key players in that was a former ambassador to the US. So there's a sort of circular, what's the word? A circular plot somewhere there in the background.
I'm willing to be corrected, but was that not Sir Peter Westmacott, who was also HMA Paris at the time of the Franco-British Council around the time Cameron came to power?
Possibly. There were about 5 members of that trust. I will do some research and introduce it into another news programme so that we direct people to the facts.
Sorry. Just quickly, Alex.
Just a codicil to that, Darach's background as he rose through the ranks was Franco-British, including supervising the disastrous Channel Tunnel project. And so there's an element of this which is stop Brexit by any means, and particularly the Franco-British axis. That's the arm of the civil service that's speaking in this wreck Trump and wreck the special relationship vector that we now have.
Yes.
Okay, well, we'll just say at this point, we were just given a little bit of a tip that the Ministry of Defence is now watching UK column closely. Presumably this is to find out what is actually going on in defence matters and defence matters overseas. And we were also given the little hint that 77 Brigade, the Army's 77 Brigade, is now also following us because, of course, they've got a duty to watch anything and everything that's happening on social media to make sure that we're not right-wing extremists, presumably. Well, we just say, if you haven't ever had a look at 77 Brigade, just go onto the Army's website and you can find a section. It's all very dark. The whole style of this section of the Army website is rather dark, sinister undertones, but it says 77th Brigade influence and outreach. And this is a bit more of the detail, who we are. And what are they actually doing? Well, they're saying that they're adapting behaviours and they're working as agents of change. So I think a few questions to be asked there about what this organisation does. But if you're watching us today, then welcome, and I hope you enjoy the news.
Right, so where are we? Let's move on to, well, it looks like David Ellis is just attempting to join us there. David, you need to turn your iPad the other direction because your orientation is incorrect. Well done. So what we're going to do is to show a little clip or a couple of little clips from the beginning of the week, because obviously there's been a load of furore over who the new leadership of the European Council is going to be, and apparently the compromise candidate is going to be Ursula von der Leyen, who most recently has been Defence Minister for Germany. And so she was visiting the European Parliament earlier in the week and had some things to say. And well, this first clip is quite interesting. Listen to this.
Now, I'm going to jump right forward now to the present day. And I'd like to talk about 4 different components which we introduced back then, which I believe are the important structural elements for setting up a European defence union. First of all, just 2-3 weeks ago, we were able to for the first time, we were able to give the red light for a European command capacity in Brussels. That's for the first time that civil and military instruments would actually be commanded together, and where these commands would actually come from one single central command office. That's an essential step forward. It was unthinkable a short while ago, but it's precisely the right approach to have if we want a European flavour to our defence policy.
So I have to say, for me, Brian, this was a pretty jaw-dropping statement, because for the last 2 years, David Ellis and the UK column have been trying to make the point about your EU Defence Union, what it means, what it represents, and one of the key aspects of this has been, as David likes to call it, single point command and control. And one of the points that we have made over the years is that if you take command and control out of the hands of national governments and you put it into the hands of the EU to pursue its foreign policy, then through treaty and so on, you're obligated to take part in whatever decisions they make. Therefore, there's no opportunity for UK citizens to influence their parliament about which actions we may or may not take part in. This is extremely dangerous.
Very dangerous, and she's giving it in, it's black and white here, Mike, isn't it? It's EU, Brussels EU, and it's civil and military. This is one of the most dangerous things for me. You're now mixing policing in with intelligence and the military. I'm going to say that this is Third Reich type stuff. I'm using that phrase deliberately. And it's under single point control. And that's exactly what David Ellis said. It will be under single point EU control.
Alex, what are your thoughts on that particular statement?
Well, I was struck in that part, Mike, by two things. One was that Mrs. von der Leyen used a German word, Kommandozentrale, if you listen to the original, which the interpreter, of course, as always, the European Parliament interpreting is excellent. The interpreter did stumble a little, as anyone would do, because it's a completely new term. So it isn't even in the interpreter's vocabulary yet, which shows how new it is, that all of a sudden Frau von der Leyen speaks about a Kommandozentrale, for which the English equivalent would be Command and Control Center, or for short C3. If you look at David Ellis's tweets, that's what he's referring to. But this one is talking about a Brussels command control center, so not the ones in Northwood, which has just been moved to Spain, or Potsdam, or Paris, or Larissa in Greece, or Rome, the 5 that we know about. This one is the one above those 5. So a new facility and a new term for it brought out in one go. And I think the other thing I would say is that if you listen to Frau von der Leyen speaking there, when she's really in her element, she trots out the English phrases in the midst of the German, particularly when she's talking about having liaised with the Americans and how the Americans are suddenly on side with all this, and NATO is on side with all this EU militarization and centralization, which further gives the ring of truth to it. It's not the EU that's lying here.
Okay, well, let's move on with some of the comments that you made.
The second important milestone for us is the establishment of the PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation. This was already centred in the Lisbon Treaty. It was never implemented. Our feeling was, our thoughts, and I know that there has been a huge amount of support from the European Parliament for that, and I am unendingly thankful to you for that, because we need to have PESCO within the Defence Union to show that we can actually develop this policy together, that we have the capacity, that we are operational, and that we can plan systematically for the long term and actually provide a European solution to crises.
So crises are going to drive the European solution, Brian, and PESCO, one of the many acronyms that build this defence union, an acronym which, okay, it's appeared in the British media from time to time, but if you were to ask the average person in the street if they'd ever heard of it or what it meant or what it represented, they wouldn't have a clue.
They wouldn't have a clue. And of course, nobody is talking about it. Nobody in any of the political parties. We're not seeing Brexit Party talk about it. We're not seeing Mr. Farage talk about it. Nobody wants to go near this subject.
Let's continue.
And another thing, alongside the commando controls and the PESCO group, something else which is very important to me. I was very pleased to hear from the Commission in the last couple of weeks when they talked about a European Defence Fund. And just in the last couple of weeks, Juncker gave us a little bit more detail about how the Commission foresees all of this. And I can only say I very much welcome this. We need a European Defence Fund. And I can no doubt tell you that at present, we are working with the finance ministers of the EU to see what type of, how such a fund would work. Because, of course, the financial mechanisms, that's why we need the financial ministers with us. We need to have the financial mechanisms. And indeed, we have our own national budgets, that's one thing. But above and beyond that, we also need to have some type of a European development fund, which we can all put into, which will cover the projects which are of interest to our countries and which are financed through this fund. So, of course, the finance ministers must talk about the projects. Eurodrone is one of these projects. The next generation of tanks, for example, is another. Also, fighter jets, all of these, nothing's been planned yet, but these are all things that we need to be thinking about over the long term. We shouldn't be doing this at a national level, however. We should immediately be thinking on a European level, because if we do this, it means that the interoperability is a given. It makes it easier for us to cooperate. Of course, if we're working on common projects, then from the very first day on, we know how to deploy this equipment, and we will have a European Defence Union, which is not simply which exists not simply in name.
So, Alex, a couple of key points there. First of all, as David Ellis has tried to present, there's a financial component to this at an EU level. That's going to require a treasury, but initially, at least, a European Defence Fund. But also, she's talking about the interoperability aspect of this, which of course includes procurement and so on. So again, in the next little section, she is basically ticking off all the boxes that we've been talking about for several years.
Yes, and again, this was trailed. Mrs. von der Leyen says "we" throughout this speech, and at one point she says "we" at the EU, or "we." She doesn't even say that. We decided in 2016, because of the Trump and Brexit votes, to repatriate European defence and security and have the continent self-secured. And in saying that, she is speaking, as she still is with that nameplate in front of her in 2019, because she hasn't been confirmed yet, she's still speaking as German Federal Minister of Defence, which she was from 2013 onwards. So this "we" was not the EU formally. This "we" was a bunch of largely German thinkers, and as someone has put in the chat room, someone would go by the name of Merit, it's a 104-page report that was issued in 2004 that set this all out, called the Venusberg report, or Venusberg if you want to spell it the English way. If you go and find that online, it spells out from 2004 onwards, in English as well as German, what the financial plans were. The interoperability is a key thing as well, because earlier in the speech, Mrs. von der Leyen has said we started in 2016 with a year of Franco-German trial military union projects, and they were difficult. It was a difficult year, she says. But then afterwards, she says, well, we need to think about next generation's fighter jets, next generation tanks being by design Dutch-German or French-German or EU-wide. So this thinking was not actually within the EU itself. I don't think the EU has been dissembling here. It was a bunch of people at national and think tank level who were thinking this way.
Okay, so we've got a final clip here. Let's listen to this one.
I think as my fourth building block, I would like to highlight what we call CARD, Coordinated Annual Review on Defence. So we would have to look at the planning very closely on a regular basis, working closely with NATO as well, because that's decisive. Because of course we've got 27 member states who are also members of NATO. NATO is very pleased. It very much welcomes the fact that we want to promote a European Defence Union, because a strong European pillar within NATO is something which they view as very, very positive. However, that means that our plans have got to be dovetailed with one another, so that we don't have redundancies, and so that we don't have doubling up, that we actually focus correctly. No single member state in Europe, and I say that about my own country as well, no single country in Europe is in a position to provide alone the system that we're going to need in the future. But together we can do it.
So together they can do it. Alex, I think there was only one thing there that I wasn't sure that the translation was quite correct about, where she used the word redundancies. Of course, what really a better way to put it might be to avoid duplication of effort. So this is another key point that we've been trying to make. Defence cuts over the last 40 years have not been about money. They've not been, I'm talking about British defence cuts, they've not been about money. They've been about getting the British military to a position where it, as she says, dovetails in with what's going on in the rest of the EU.
Yes, and when you interpret simultaneously, you have to use sometimes infelicitous single words because there's no time for anything more. My memory of having listened to the German, this is the first time I've listened to the English, is I don't think it was the word redundant that was used. It was another German word, and to my memory, it was a difficult one to interpret, which has a spectrum of meanings somewhere between not duplicating and not actually having the same people pay for the same thing. So it's really fuzzy in the original whether Mrs. von der Leyen here is talking about avoiding redundancies or duplications for financial reasons or for ideological reasons.
But at the end of the day, the cat is well and truly out of the bag, as the saying goes, because the utter silence on the UK side of the channel, this process has been progressing on the European side of the channel. And it's right out on the open now. So really, there's no reason at this point why this whole issue should not be brought into the Brexit debate.
Well, quite. And I think the moment during that hearing of Mrs. von der Leyen by the MPs that crystallised that was when the very experienced Conservative MEP, Geoffrey Van Orden, raised a question with her and said, should we not be bolstering NATO instead of bolstering EU as a defence and security entity in its own right? And he tacked onto that the question, how do you see the British-European defence and security relationship after Brexit? And Mrs. von der Leyen was again straight out. She said, we would love a close relationship, but it's up to the British to decide. And that is the case. It is still up to Her Majesty's government to decide whether they go with the terms of this white paper on the future defence and security relationship or not. At the moment, sadly, both of the candidates for Prime Minister are making ominous, unconstitutional noises about having a deep and special security and defence relationship, i.e. they wish to embrace it. But Mrs. von der Leyen is not pulling a fast one here. She is saying it's up to you, British.
And that's the key point, Brian. This is not a done deal yet. But if it's not part of the national discussion, then well, it will be a done deal because it'll happen behind the scenes.
It's incredible. What I see coming up is that we'll have a Brexit declared to the public. We've achieved the state of Brexit, but behind the scenes, everything to do with matters of defence is totally locked into the European system in this way, and therefore Brexit, of course, is an utter lie, but also we've lost control of our country because we've lost control of the armed forces. So this is incredibly deceitful politics by all of the parties in Westminster because they're all involved in the cover-up at the moment. Okay.
Let's move on.
Well, let's move on. This is the reality of the British Armed Forces at the moment. So, a little story from Plymouth Live. Royal Navy cancels HMS Queen Elizabeth event due to leak on board. And this was a visit to the ship by members of the press who were going to be shown around and have a look at facilities. And they received an email. We regret to inform you that today's media facility on board HMS Queen Elizabeth has been cancelled due to a change in the ship's programme. Well, that's what they got first of all, but it was followed by a little bit more. Following a minor issue with an internal system on HMS Queen Elizabeth, the ship's company were required to remove a small volume of water from the ship. Do you like how that was phrased, Mike?
Yes.
I think a really excellent piece of word crafting. HMS Queen Elizabeth has had a minor issue relating to water from an internal system. At no point was there damage or breach to the hull. Well, that's a relief. The issue was isolated as soon as possible and all the water has now been pumped out. The ship, which was due to return to Portsmouth for a planned maintenance period later in the week, is now returning earlier than planned. So what's gone on here? I'll just bring in this. Luckily, there were no aircraft on board. I'm not sure whether that statement's true. This was the image that Plymouth Live used to support their article, and there don't appear to be any aircraft on that deck. Possibly there was some below deck, but what a state of affairs. Obviously, this was something significant, otherwise they wouldn't be going back to port early. A small volume of water, what does that mean? I wonder whether this is a problem with stern glands, so this is the propeller shaft.
The ship had this problem before, did it not?
There was a problem before, so something going on here. But this is the state of affairs in the Royal Navy at the moment. We cannot get an aircraft carrier built at sea, operational. What did we do? Well, we scrapped all of the operational carriers in order to progress EU defence union. And now we're left with what can only be described as a shambles. But of course, it all gets worse because we've been talking for some time about recruiting. Now, this is the 16th of May, but an article where it's saying Capita is just a disaster. Newly released figures show that on the 1st of April this year, the army was 8.5% short, 6,930 soldiers of its headcount target of 82,000. But it also goes on to say that the Navy and Air Force are also 3.2% down. That's about 1,500 missing service personnel. So utter disaster since we had the privatisation of recruiting. We are now getting the heads up, is the expression, that Capita is not going to be renewed in that contract. There's going to be another company or consortium brought forward, and apparently the sum of £2 billion is going to be allocated to recruiting. Is this because there is an emergency on the
recruitment side?
They're going to need these troops because there's an emergency coming in Europe. That's what I wonder. Sorry, I'll just bring this graph in. It's a very good article on the A Register, so do have a look. But this is showing the decline in recruiting since Capita's been involved. So pretty amazing stuff.
Yes. Okay, now Alex, let's move over to Georgia. And of course, since 2008, or well, since before that, there's been problems between Georgia and Russia. And of course, there was a so-called war, which Russia intervened with. But it seems that, problems continue to build because this is a Georgian TV anchor being a bit inappropriate on television with respect to Vladimir Putin. I curse your parents, F off, Vlad, you who rule the Russians as slaves.
Indeed so, Mike. And if you look at the earring there, you get a sense of what's up. You actually mentioned a moment ago, before we sadly lost David Ellis from the connection, that he was in the wrong orientation. And that seems to be what's happened with Mr. Gabunia. He's decided at this stage in his young career that he's homosexual, and he's gone out with it on an absolute vengeance. So he's bounced off one wall and onto the other, having first sought refuge in the Georgian Orthodox Church, Solace, I should say. He's now decided to turn against them. He actually required armed guards prior to this incident on Rustam 2 television, which is the most watched news station on Georgia, and basically cheerled the revolution for Saakashvili 15 years ago. He already needed armed guards because in the previous outburst he'd cursed the Virgin Mary. You have to remember, like the Ukraine, this is a country where until about a decade ago, adults and young people would go out dressed in dark clothes, ladies in long skirts and so on. And all of a sudden you've got this Euro-style rainbow flag waving contingent out, very much, I think, endangering the rights and tolerance of integrated homosexuals as much as the rest of the population. So Gabunia has caused a huge shock here by cursing. He's been given a 2-month suspension from broadcasting. Some of his journalistic colleagues have pointed out that this is, totally unlike him. But some have said that fame went to his head. President Putin was asked in response in a press call whether he was going to accede to the State Duma now calling for sanctions on Georgian mineral water exports. And he replied with a 5-minute history lecture, which you can find on the Russia Insight channel on YouTube, the most recent of their subtitled excerpts, which I'm sad to say accurately summarizes the genocides and outrages which the Georgians perpetrated on Abkhazia and South Ossetia down the centuries. And this is what this next slide is about, because since the Speaker of the Duma was given a chair or a platform to speak in the Georgian parliament 3 weeks ago, this kind of third wave protest has been going on. People with English banners reminiscent of the white helmets in Syria going straight to English, so it's not really about the situation in the region, it's to get Western attention. People have been coming out with these banners referring to Abkhazia and South Ossetia, whose independence is now recognized by Russia and which have Russian troops in them. And these banners say 20% of my country is occupied by Russia. And that is the context against which President Putin responded. He said, we don't want to rise to the bait of this man. He's not worthy of the attention. Instead, we just need to focus on the historical facts here. And this, I'm afraid, is the root of what the EU and its member states are, and NATO are faced with now. Do we go to war for not even the whole of society in these small Eastern European countries that want to radically break with Russia? It's actually for the sake of a very small minority of, shall we say, turned heads or even mind control victims. I'd suggest Mr. Gabuni is getting into that category, who have, blow their fuse and rant at President Putin, a bit like Kim Darroch, really, with ranting at Trump, except even more obscene. Is it for the sake of these few that the whole of the West wishes to enter into a war footing with Russia?
So what do you think is the possibility of trouble kicking off in Georgia again?
Quite high. I've seen this before over the last 20 years in many cycles. This is the time of year when the protests get going. And if they can be sustained through into the autumn, then what you tend to find is, and this has already happened a couple of times in the current episode, you get stormings. So we've already had a storming of Parliament and then a storming by the other side in Georgia, as it were. The other side of society stormed Rustavi 2's TV studio after this outburst, demanding that Gabunia be sacked. So if this wave of protests is kept up a few more months with who knows who paying the purse strings of the protesters and feeding and keeping them out in the streets, then yes, it can go very nasty. Regime change does happen pretty quickly in countries like Georgia when it does happen.
And do you think, just to end this, do you think Russia would intervene again?
I think that they have taken a leaf out of the West's book, and I think they're much more interested in soft power now than they are in sending troops in. They're not afraid to. They did in 2008 to protect their citizens in South Ossetia and Abkhazia from further abuse. But at this stage, I think Putin is showing a clear indication that the vector they want to go with is winning the court of public opinion.
Okay. Well, US drones.
Yeah, Alex, you were interested in this one, but the US has moved drones from Poland into Romania, which it says is the result of effectively works at the air station. So this is the report. Air Force unmanned aircraft are flying out of a temporary camp in Romania, a move that puts intelligence gathering capabilities closer to the Black Sea. And the shift of Reaper drones was prompted by construction at their main operating base in northwest Poland. This is all very convenient, isn't it? You've got some works at the base, but that means you're going to have to shift your equipment into another country. I don't know whether you want to comment on that, Alex, or not.
Yeah, what I would say is if you're down in the Romanian sector of Eastern Europe, then you're very much able to scoot out over the Black Sea and provide cover for US warships, which also, by the way, are, as usual in the summer, but even more so this year, on a slightly increased tempo in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea. They occasionally make use of the Montreux Accords to sail through the Bosphorus and make a show of strength off the Georgian coast. Romania is the western side of the Black Sea, so it's of a piece with providing cover for further incursions.
Okay, well, let's just briefly move on to Iran. And a Russian article to start off with. This is, I'm not even going to try to pronounce, maybe Alex can tell us what this is called in a second. And I have to say that Russia and China really blaming Britain for escalating the situation with Iran at the moment. So this article in English is called "British Marines Left Syria's Army Without Fuel." They're saying Washington's hybrid war against Damascus and Tehran could escalate into full-scale hostilities. The UK Royal Marine seizure of Grace 1, an Iranian supertanker carrying oil last week, was most likely a move which has been thoroughly engineered by both London and Washington. It's no coincidence that US National Security Advisor John Bolton was one of the first to react to the tanker's seizure, describing it as excellent news. And they go on to say apparently a turning point has dawned and the US and its close allies have decided to crank up maximum pressure on Iran and Syria. The July 4th incident in the Strait of Gibraltar can be considered as a new stage of hybrid war waged against the Syrian President Bashar Assad and the Iranian leadership. And they're saying any military action in Tehran in response may spiral into real combat actions and even into a massive war in the Middle East. And this is followed up by the Chinese then. With this article, restraint diplomacy, only way to defuse Iran crisis. And they're saying that there could be an unintended conflict if a Pandora's box is opened. By now, it's more than obvious that Washington is doubling down on its maximum pressure on Tehran. The escalation of mutual threats between Tehran and Washington appears inevitable. was this rash decision that opened Pandora's box. This is the U.S. attitude to the nuclear deal. Our advice, however, is that all parties be very careful, and especially the British, whose Royal Navy just seized an Iranian oil tanker, and of course Tehran, which just threatened to reciprocate. Well, the UK, France, Germany, and the High Representative of the EU have issued a statement on this issue following IAEA verification that Iran has started enriching above JCPOA limits. France, Germany, the UK, and the High Representative have issued a joint statement. The foreign ministers of France, Germany, and the United Kingdom and the High Representative expressed deep concern that Iran is pursuing activities inconsistent with its commitments under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and so it goes on. But Alex, it seems to me that there's a bit of good cop, bad cop going on here, because obviously Britain took that action against the Iranian tanker last week. The US keeping the pressure on. It seems like Iran can't move no matter what.
And the other side of this, Mike, is the Syrian angle. What is the legal status? It might not be a lawful decision, but there may be allegedly a legal decision by the EU to sanction Syrian oil imports. It's by no means clear that there has been such a decision. I've not seen any chapter and verse on it. And this was something that Mr. Galloway raised on his show the other night with a Gibraltarian caller, or an Irishman in Gibraltar, calling in and saying what's being reported locally here in Gibraltar is that the Marines were sent out to comply with an EU law, as he called it, as a layman. It doesn't seem that that's the case. That's you can say Iranian tankers supplying oil is one target that's dangerous enough. But if you're doing the seizure on behalf of the importing country, then you better be on very firm legal grounds for what you're attempting to do. And it remains a unilateral action. Of course, it can be replicated. British and American tankers could be very vulnerable to Iranians grappling their way on board. The precedent's been set now.
Yeah, so there's a risk of this escalating. We'll keep a close eye on it. Now, just briefly, if you like what the UK column does and you would like to support us, then please head over to the community website where the options are there. That's ukcolumn.org/community. A reminder that AV10 DVDs are still available at the UK column shop, and a brief reminder of AV 10.1, which is taking place on the 27th of October at Holiday Inn, Wrights Lane, Kensington. Details and tickets at alternativeview.co.uk, but those are selling quite quickly. Now, on Monday, we mentioned the fact that today and tomorrow, the Defend Media Freedom Conference is taking place. This is the UK and Canadian governments working together to defend media freedom and improve the safety of journalists who report across the world. Of course, it's not quite all it's about, but we'll come on to that in a second. Now, this conference is being supported by Luminate. Well, who are they? Well, here they are, building stronger societies, a world where people and institutions can work together to build just and fair societies. And perhaps this gives us a clue as to a little bit more about what this conference is actually about. It's not about media freedom. It's about building just and fair societies. I wonder what the definition of that is. I suspect the British Foreign Office could probably tell us. So the question is, who is Luminate? Well, they're part of the Odemeyer Group. And they have this lot as their board. Pierre Odemeyer, who is the founder of eBay, of course. Well, the other name that's of particular interest in that lot is this gentleman here, Stephen King. Now, why is he of interest? Well, he's from the BBC, of course, because why would you push this type of exercise without the BBC there? So he was ex-BBC World Trust. Now, the excuse for holding the event, of course, is this. The number of 2018, they say, was the worst year on record for violence and abuse against journalists. 9 in 10 cases of killed journalists are unresolved. 13% of the world's population enjoys a free press. And at least 99 journalists were killed, a further 348 imprisoned, 60 taken hostage by non-state groups in 2018. So, I mean, these are all disgraceful statistics, and something should be done about it perhaps, but the question is this conference really about dealing with that, or is it about doing something else? Well, you'll be glad to know that the Department for International Development is intending to defend media freedom. So how are they going to do that? Well, Harriet Baldwin was speaking this morning at this conference and said, at a time when journalists are attacked in record numbers and too many independent media organisations are collapsing or threatened by political interests, today's aid package could not be more crucial. So what aid package is she talking about? Well, it's £15 million to be provided by the Department for International Development, which includes £12 million for a consortium led by BBC Media Action to help existing media improve their business models. So, of course, this is on top of the money that was mentioned, that was named by Jeremy Hunt on Monday, which is £15 million, part of a £100 million package to deal with counter-disinformation. So this is BBC Media Action. Who are they? I wonder, we'll just remind ourselves who they are, because this is Juliet Harkin, no longer with BBC Media Action, but speaking, saying that we, BBC Media Action, worked in 2004 with individuals within the Syrian ministry who wanted change and get them to be the drivers of that, and tried to get them to be the drivers of that. She said, all media development work that has been done in Syria has, in my opinion, been predicated upon the idea that there can be change from within. You have an authoritarian regime and you find who the reformers are within that and you work with them. So what have we got here? We've got money then going to BBC Media Action in order to promote and to push change in societies through the Odemeyer Foundation and so on. So another £3 million will go to the Aswat Hora programme, headed up by the Institute for War and Peace Reporting. Well, who would they be? Who could be on that board of that particular organisation? None other than Sir David Bell, former chairman of Common Purpose, and the sort of lead protagonist in the attempt to shut down a free media in this country in 2011 with he was on the Leveson panel. So that's good stuff. I can't think of anybody better to be receiving £3 million there. And then, of course, DFID is also strongly committed to developing a strong and free media as a vital part of achieving the UN Development Goal 16 to support peace, justice, and strong institutions. The new programmes come on top of an announcement of another £12 million, is what they're saying, made in March 2019 for the PROTECT programme. This is protecting rights, openness and transparency, enhancing civic transformation, which aims to improve media freedom within developing countries. In total, DFID has committed up to £27 million to protect media freedom this year. But as I say, Brian, this is not about media freedom. This is about transformation of societies. And they're wanting to use a so-called free media, and what they mean by that is a media controlled by Western interests to make that change.
It smells of open society to me, the whole look of it, the whole feeling, the words they're using. I would guess that Mr. George Soros and Open Society is somewhere in the background. But isn't it remarkable to see BBC Media Action in the frame again? And okay, we've got Sir David Bell, ex-Common Purpose, but this is the Common Purpose agenda to get into these countries and to, inverted commas, train the new leaders. Alex, this is very, very insidious and dangerous stuff, but we have now got the taking over of countries by what's labelled soft power, but if you analyse what the outcome is, it's not soft at all.
No, Brian, inside the minds of its victims, who are the cheerleaders, the presenters of it, it's an extremely hard and harsh regime which can destroy people's character and cause them to have breakdowns. I fear that's what Mr. Gabunia went in for. One detail on that, I'm not sure how much this BBC Media Freedom event overlaps with the Global Media Freedom Initiative that the FCO was controlling access to. But a few minutes before we went live,
Alex.
It's the same one, isn't it? Yes. Well, it was reported by a couple of channels just before we went live that the Foreign Office had banned RT and Sputnik from attending this Media Freedom Initiative, although they put their request in good time.
Unfortunately, you've just jumped the gun, because that's exactly the point I was about to make. So it is a bit ironic that the Defend Media Freedom event has in fact not given accreditation to RT or Sputnik to attend. And in fact, the British government appears to have not issued visas on time for that. And of course, the other thing which is not getting any coverage at this event is Julian Assange, and he should probably just be mentioned there as well. So there we go. The British government, alongside the Canadian government, doing all they can to defend media freedom, so long as you're following the societal changes that they want you to follow.
Yes, and you've got to get it right. And we just wanted to, where are we? Just end on this one because somebody pointed out to us that they're getting a little bit suspicious over Brexit. So the Sun here, sign language, motorway signs to be translated into different languages after foreign drivers cause chaos on the M6. And if you think this is a joke, it's not. This is it in the Smart Highways magazine. What are they talking about? Well, they've had some problems on the M6. And so they're going to use automatic number plate readers to work out what nationality lorries are. And then what's going to happen, this is up in Cumbria, is the sign will print in an appropriate language instructions. And this is to stop foreign lorry drivers coming off the motorway and into smaller roads. It says the pilot's taking place in Cumbria, where 7 million of improvements is taking place along the M6 north of Carlisle. The latest phase of the work is focused on the roundabout at Busy Junction 44 of the motorway, and lorry drivers are being warned in German, French, Polish, Romanian, Dutch, Spanish, Lithuanian, Slovak and Hungarian when the roundabout is closed for overnight work. Highways England says they believe this to be the first time in the UK that electronic signs have been used in this way to get information to continental truckers. So there you are. Brexit, definitely without the exit, and we can't repair the potholes in the road, but we're going to spend millions on making sure that foreign lorry drivers can actually read road signs. One could argue that if they can't, Mike, they're not safe on the roads. We'll leave that for discussion. Alex, thank you very much for joining us. Pleasure to have you back. And we'll say to our viewers and listeners that if you're not already a subscriber to UK Column, please consider taking out a subscription, because we can only do what we do with your financial support. Thank you very much for joining us, and we will be back at the same time on Friday. Bye-bye.